In the history of guitar-driven music, a number of guitarists have made an interesting decision, which I would love to be able to time travel and pick their brain. And that is, instead of going with E standard, which is certainly the standard for music, A 440 pitch and E standard tuning on the guitar, but there have been a bunch of people who've, for whatever reasons, decided they wanted to go with E flat standard. And that's a topic that's always fascinated me, and I never see it written about in interviews, and yet it's the first question I would pretty much ask any of these musicians I'm about to talk about. And of course, it really goes back for me, ground zero is Jimi Hendrix, who was E flat standard the whole way. And I just would dearly love to know what motivated him. Certainly at the time in the 60s, I don't know of any other groups or musicians that were working in E flat standard. It was all E standard. And so Hendrix was, if to me, is again ground zero for that. After that, you had some bands. For example, there was a band called the Pink Fairies, sort of a proto-punk band, kind of a weird English band, Pink Fairies, and they had a single called The Snake, and the B-side, Do It. Oh, amazing single, by the way, if you haven't never heard it. The Pink Fairies, check it out. They did it in E flat standard. Creedence Clearwater Revival, interestingly enough, didn't go E flat standard, but on some songs would go all the way a whole step down across the board into D standard tuning. And if you listen to Bad Moon Rising, the jangle that you hear from those guitars is because it's the looser strings in a D standard tuning. Creedence did that on a couple of songs, at least certainly on the Green River album. They might have even done it on Proud Mary. I'm not entirely sure, but definitely on Bad Moon Rising. And if you listen to the James Gang single, Walk Away, that one is an A flat, which I'm pretty sure it meant it was E flat standard tuning. Robin Trower in the early 70s, he started in E standard, went to E flat standard after a couple of albums, and he now plays in D standard. And his motivation there, he wanted to get thicker strings and still be able to do a lot of bending, so he loosened up the pitch. But then, interestingly enough, you have the band Kiss in the 70s, and they went E flat standard. Not really sure what the thinking was, but I imagine they just wanted it to be a deeper, heavier thing. But it might also be the choice of making it easier to sing vocally, because certainly taking everything down a half step allows you to do things. I know that I can, on my best days, maybe hit an A flat singing, but hitting an A, never been able to do that very well. So Kiss went with E flat standard. Thin Lizzy on their Jailbreak album, the song Jailbreak, and also The Boys Are Back in Town, those are in E flat standard. But there are other songs on that album that are in standard tuning, and when they played live, I think they was pretty much all E flat standard at that point. Motorhead, very glaring example of E flat standard tuning. And again, I would love to have been able to ask Lemmy, why E flat? And an interesting question about all this or is raised when you bring up the band Black Sabbath, because they started in E standard for the first two albums, then went way down. By Master of Reality, they were even going so far as C sharp standard. If you listen to a song like After Forever, no, that might be D standard. Anyway, they were dropping way down, and for a couple albums, Sabbath was playing in very deep tunings. But then all of a sudden, by Technical Ecstasy and Never Say Die, and then when they got up with Dio, they were back in E standard. So who the heck knows what's going on there? But the big blast of E flat standard in the late 70s was Van Halen, because all their classic David Lee Roth era stuff was all E flat standard. Except, maybe some things were even lower. I think Hear About It Later, at least, was... They might have gone to like drop D, but that would be drop D flat. Then you have Stevie Ray Vaughan in the early 80s, and he was E flat standard. You had Rat and Poison, maybe a couple other LA bands. I don't know. I never went too deep into that hair metal thing, but they were in E flat standard. The Smithereens were in E flat standard. Would have loved to ask Pat Denizio, why did you want to do that? It really seemed to work for them. And then along came Guns N' Roses, and they really put E flat standard right back on the map with a stamp. Another band from that early 90s era was called Extreme, and they had a couple of power ballads. They had was it Be With You? No, what was the one? More Than Words, and Wholehearted. Anyway, they were in E flat standard for whatever reason. And then you had the grunge come along, and grunge had tons of bands in E flat standard, but not all of them. Not all of them, but like Alice in Chains, E flat standard, and then down to drop D flat. Mudhoney, another example. A Jersey band called Monster Magnet. They were in E flat standard. So that grungy, sludgy vibe. And in fact, that led to a whole other question, which was if you go to drop D, but see, drop D is still based off E standard, so it's not the same question to me as when you go to E flat standard as your whole across the board approach to the guitar. Helmet, actually, they were in drop D, but then on Betty, they did start experimenting with drop D flat on a song like I Know, and a couple other ones on that record. Anyway. But then you have bands like Godflesh coming along and going all the way down to B. Sleep was in, I'm pretty sure they were a whole step down on everything and then dropped C. So there was all that shit. And then, then a whole other aspect of music that I never went for much with Korn and 7-string guitars and things in B. That's another issue. But again, to me, the E flat question has always been a fascinating one. Green Day, what was in E flat standard, at least on the big Dookie album. I don't know a ton of their stuff, but that album certainly was an E flat standard. Weezer's first album was an E flat standard. And I believe Pinkerton also. But then the third album, the Green album, was in E standard. So, who knows? And then this begs the question, what is the psychology behind the pitch? And this brings to mind a very unpleasant subject, in my opinion, which is varispeed, which is the faking using tape speed. It doesn't happen so much in the digital age. Oh, it's different. But back in the day when it was all analog and it was tape, you could adjust the pitch and the speed of the recording with the speed of the tape. But this would, if you sped it up, it would also it would raise the pitch. And at some point it could become ridiculous if you sped it up really fast. And in the punk era, there are some glaring and, to my mind, infuriating examples of this. One would be Clash City Rockers by The Clash, where unbeknownst to the band, their producer decided to speed it up a half tone, a half step, and speed up the track. When the band heard it, they fired him. But the original single version of that, there's some confusion over the actual pitch of the recording. And a band that's near and dear to my heart called the Buzzcocks, they, for whatever reasons, allowed their producer to get away with murder. Their first and third albums, pretty much all recorded in E standard and sped up a half tone to give the producer's justification, give it a bit more energy and whatever. But to me, it makes me sick. Interestingly, though, the Buzzcocks' second album, Love Bites, I'm virtually certain has none of it. At any rate, what is the reasoning behind going to E flat standard versus E? Have any of you out there ever done it in your bands? I would love to know more about this because, again, I never see anybody talk about it, but it's fascinated me. And I hope this video was mildly interesting. Have a good one.